Hmm. Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends, welcome to this virtual side event presented by the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the United Nations on the margins of 65th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, entitled Between War and Pandemic, Voices from the Field. We are very happy today to be joined by a large number of participants from various parts of the world. The event is being broadcasted live on the UN Web TV as well as on the Facebook page of the Armenian Mission in New York. Today's event will discuss a very important and sensitive aspect of gender equality. We will seek to address the impacts of global healthcare crisis, humanitarian emergencies, conflict and instabilities on women and girls. 20 years after the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, women continue to be at risk of injustices and inequalities, especially those in situations of conflict and humanitarian emergencies. The COVID-19 pandemic has aggravated such disproportionalities affecting women and girls, including in terms of access to essential services, resilience, and livelihood opportunities. Among hardest hit were women in conflict zone who were trapped between war and pandemic. Despite the calls for the international solidarity and the United Nations Secretary General's appeal for a global ceasefire, past year has seen an unprecedented level of violence, war, and human suffering. Last September, a large-scale war was unleashed against Nagorno-Karabakh in the middle of global pandemic, disrupting the decades-long efforts for peace, development, and human security, and causing a major humanitarian crisis. The outbreak of violence, humanitarian emergencies, and their disproportionate impacts on women and girls have clearly demonstrated that the United Nations needs to re-equip itself better in delivering in prevention function, on gender equality, and on women and peace and security agenda. More needs to be done to engage affected populations and to support those who amplify their voices. I would like to note that within the United Nations family, Armenia has been consistently raising the issue of strengthening protection mechanisms, particularly protection rights of women affected by conflict. Dear friends, I am very glad that today we are joined by Ms. Maria Victoria Cabrera-Beleza Mavic, who is the founder and Chief Executive Officer, Global Network for Women Peace Builders, whom I would like to thank for very important work that they are doing around the world. I'd also like to warmly welcome our panelists who are joining from various parts of the world. Ms. Lindsay Snell, investigative journalist with extensive experience in covering conflict and humanitarian crises, including in Nagorno-Karabakh, who is joining now from Baghdad. Ms. Lika Zakarian, journalist reporting directly from Nagorno-Karabakh, where she was born and raised, and also reporting during the September and during the offensive that started in September all the way through until November 9. Mr. Shant Sheher-Timian, MD, pediatric surgeon and an assistant professor of surgery at University of California, Los Angeles, who was there and helping alleviate the suffering of women and children in Nagorno-Karabakh. And Dr. Karina Avedisian, political scientist focused on social movements, new media, and civil society. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's session, Ms. Lucy Varpetian, who is the chairperson of the Armenian Bar Association of America, a non-profit US entity, and who has kindly agreed to steer today's conversation. With this, I am very happy to pass the floor to our distinguished moderator, and we'll be taking this important conversation forward. Please, Lucy.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the honor of being here today. And from the Armenian Bar Association, it is truly an honor to participate in this program. We have this morning for you 5 very different perspectives about the disproportionate effects on women brought upon us by a global pandemic. But then when you're living in a region that is exasperated by conflicts and humanitarian emergencies, this places women at greater risk of violence, injustice, and inequality. All of which is translated into lack of access to essential healthcare and sustenance and all other basic human needs. We will listen to each presenter and discuss these different aspects that are impacting women. And as we go through each presenter, I ask you, the audience, to keep in mind the words of a great American poet, Maya Angelou, and whether you see in your mind's eye that woman, that young girl, and that child caught up in a conflict so much bigger than her, waged by people driven by greed and power. The poem, Still I Rise, is an assertion of the dignity and resilience of marginalized people in the face of oppression. I'll share with you a few excerpts from the poem. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? She goes on to say, you may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Our first presenter, Maria Victoria Cabrera Baeza, and she's asked us to call her Mavic, and so I will. If you haven't already heard her speak or been touched by her work, then you will certainly know her by her reputation for peace building around the globe. In particular, that focus being the role of the women in the peace building process. She speaks not of waging war, but of waging peace. Her life's work has been to empower women, raise awareness, and provide tools to women in marginalized communities so that they have the ability to rise. Ms. Cabrera, Ms. Baeza, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you hear me well?
Very well, loud and clear, please.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator, for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And my very special thanks and greetings to His Excellency Ambassador Mer Morgarian, the permanent representative of Armenia to the United Nations, and very importantly, the chair of the 65th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the biggest and most vibrant annual event at the UN here in New York. Greetings as well to my fellow speakers and to you, our dear audience members. This panel discussion titled Between War and Pandemic, Women's Voices from the Field cannot be more timely and relevant. No crisis is gender neutral. And because of women's secondary status in society, women are disproportionately impacted during crisis. However, there is no other crisis that has exacerbated existing patterns of gender inequality and targeted vulnerable women than the ongoing pandemic. The experiences of our organization, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, in implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda reinforce the theme of this event, as indeed women, especially local women, are caught between the pandemic and the conflict. Exactly 1 year ago today, I was interviewed for an article by Talif Dean on Interpress Service titled Coronavirus Claims Its First UN Casualty. And that casualty being referred to was last year's Commission on the Status of Women session. Several hundreds of workshops, panel discussions, and other events were canceled, not to mention flights and hotel reservations. And now, here we are, more than 800 meetings and parallel events during these 2 weeks, a big number of them organized by civil society. This is a testament to the flexibility and agility of civil society during this pandemic. But more importantly, it is what civil society does on the ground in local communities directly affected by the violent conflicts. And at the onset of the pandemic, the global network of women peace builders and our civil society members and partners, including those in Armenia, have taken on the roles of first responders and frontliners at the same time that they continue their important peace building work. So at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, our work takes place at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And at the onset of the crisis, we've worked with local women and youth peace builders in different countries and communities to distribute relief goods, face masks, hygiene, and sexual and reproductive health products, which, by the way, we know are often not included in relief packs. We have also provided online counseling to women who were victims of or at risk of gender-based violence. We all know how, we all know, and we are all extremely concerned about the exponential increase in cases of gender-based violence, including especially domestic violence during this time. Another important element of our work is in information dissemination, producing factual information, often in local languages, working with community radio and other media practitioners to distribute factual information on how the pandemic could be arrested or how the virus can be prevented from spreading. It's incredibly worrisome that even up to this time, many people, especially in remote rural communities, believe that the pandemic is a hoax. And for a good number of them, their main sources of information are Facebook and TikTok. The strength of the response of civil society, especially women and youth peace builders, relies on its swiftness and responsiveness to the special needs of women and girls. While many governments, when the pandemic broke out, were still not certain on what actions they will take, and with all due respect, some of them were paralyzed by their own politicking and bureaucracy, the women and youth peace builders in local communities are already out there. At the national level, we've been working with governments, including the Armenian government, in developing and implementing national action plans or other mechanisms to translate the words of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions into realistic and necessary actions on the ground. And during this pandemic, there have been several discussions, including a recent regional consultation that we held with civil society in South Caucasus, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, wherein there was a lot of emphasis in looking at national action plans as an instrument, not just in terms of response to the pandemic, but equally important as an instrument in promoting inclusive and sustainable recovery. And one point that was underscored was that for the national action plans to become effective instruments in responding to this pandemic, and all other crises for that matter, it has to have a localization strategy. And here I would like to point out that is one of the elements of our work in Armenia. We've traveled to Tavush and Shunik to meet with local authorities and local civil society in those regions and discuss how the resolutions, particularly Armenia's National Action Plan, can be applied or should be applied in the local areas. At the global level, we have established a COVID-19 and Women, Peace and Security database in the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, but it's of course available to everyone who works on this agenda. And the database documents the specific impacts of the pandemic on women, peace and security, and their responses to the conflict, to the crisis, and the ongoing violent conflicts in their communities. This is a critical tool to promote gender responsive and conflict sensitive policymaking, as well as the development of effective COVID-19 response and recovery. I am also proud to point out that the Global Network of Women Peace Builders is one of the initiators of the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is pooled funding mechanism dedicated to the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and gender responsive humanitarian action, and focusing on efforts of local women's rights organizations and civil society groups. Another important mechanism wherein GNWP led the advocacy for is the newly established Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action, which is a partnership and coordinating mechanism that promotes dedicated funding for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, monitoring and accountability. And it is part of the commemoration of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, and a critical part of the Generation Equality Forum that is taking place, in fact, at the end of the CSW and continuing in Paris in the summer. One critical element of our work that I would like to emphasize here is our collaboration with the media to challenge the dominant images of women as passive victims of conflict, but rather highlight their agency as leaders, peace builders, and decision makers. As most of us know, that one of the most important element of the Resolution 1325 is its pillar on participation that calls on member states, the Security Council, the parties to the conflict, civil society, and all stakeholders to guarantee the meaningful participation of women in decision-making at all levels on peace and security matters. The resolution is now over 20 years old, but when you look at the media, particularly its coverage of conflicts, you still see women as victims or as refugees or internally displaced, but never in their agency as leaders and peace builders and decision makers. So the partnership with the media hope to challenge that dominant narrative of women as victims. And it also aims to generate broad public support for the implementation of national action plans and local action plans and regional action plans on Resolution 1325. I am very happy to share with all of you today that we are actually facilitating a workshop on women, peace and security with the Armenian media beginning tomorrow. So expect seeing more news about peace building efforts in Armenia beginning tomorrow and beyond. At this point in time, we see local women peace builders since the beginning of the pandemic, as I emphasized earlier, responding so quickly because that is in their DNA. That is what they do. They live and work with the most vulnerable, so they know what is needed on the ground. Like they courageously build peace amidst wars. Instead of being silenced by the violence, women peace builders fearlessly stand on the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis instead of retreating from fear of this invisible enemy. I want to emphasize once again that in this extraordinary time in our global history, we need a bold vision and long-term transformative approaches more than ever. Without a focus on conflict prevention, mediation, conflict resolution, and reconstruction, the impact of COVID-19 in conflict-affected situations will be irreversible. Let me end with an appeal to all of those listening to us, including especially policymakers and decision makers. It is to our best interest to work with civil society, to work with women and youth peace builders at all times, but especially during this global health crisis. Peace cannot be one of the casualties of this pandemic. And as the Secretary General said in his report to the Security Council during the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325 in October, at its core, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a crisis prevention agenda. Thank you, and I look forward to listening to my fellow panelists and our interaction with our dear audience.
Thank you so much, Mavic, very informative. Just let me say that for those in the Zoom program, if you have questions, we would encourage you to submit them in the Q&A feature, and we will ask questions at the end. I certainly have one, Mavic, for you when we're ready to do the Q&A about the role of social media, not just to inform the general population, because as you said, sometimes that's the only source of information, but some of the negative implications. So we'll come back to that at the end when we're doing the Q&A. Our next presenter is Ms. Lindsay Snell. She is a print and video journalist specializing in conflict and humanitarian crisis. She has covered the conflict in Syria and was the first to report on the use of the mercenaries in the war against Artsakh. And interestingly, I hope you get to hear about how she came upon that information. For many reporters, we use words like thorough, insightful, but for Lindsay, we also have to use the word brave. It is the rarest of rare individuals who will go into a conflict zone in the search of truth, in the search of justice. And she has, we were saying that she's become a household name in many Armenian households, including mine. We're grateful for her courage because she becomes an echo for all those women trapped in conflict zones. Ms. Snell.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Having covered many wars in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and then of course in Karabakh, the difference in Karabakh, especially in terms of impact on women, was very pronounced, partly because immediately the Azerbaijani and Turkish forces were hitting the civilian areas in Karabakh. And usually in war zones, there's a place, there's a way for women, for children, for non-combatants to sort of get out of the way and remain safe. But in Karabakh, this wasn't even possible because civilian areas were being bombarded constantly. I think also women were grappling with their husbands, the men in the household being gone because of the sheer number of volunteers needed to fight in the war. And even outside of Karabakh, even in Yerevan, the fact that so many volunteers were needed left a lot of women alone. And this made the effects on women much, much more pronounced. And I think in terms of the future outlook for women in Karabakh, and the insights that I gained reporting from Karabakh and the women that I've spoken to there, they're very scared of the future. Things still feel very uncertain and unstable to them. And they're afraid of having children and sort of moving forward with their lives as normal because things don't feel normal yet in Karabakh. And that's what I keep hearing. Women are also very scared of the lingering ill effects of stress. And a lot of them have told me that they're getting migraines constantly now. There's a lot of PTSD that hasn't really been dealt with yet. And this seems to be hitting women disproportionately in Karabakh because they were immediately on the front lines of the war, basically. And I think that these effects are lingering and they're very, very worried.
You've covered, I'm just going to jump in with a question, if that's okay. You've covered war, and I use Artsakh and Karabakh interchangeably. Artsakh is, of course, the Armenian word for Karabakh. You've covered wars in many countries. How would you say that the war in Artsakh differed from other wars? And certainly when I say that, I'm very aware that you are present at the time that the war is happening, not in the aftermath, but during the war, when you're witnessing, hearing the shelling and the bombing, the run for shelter. Clearly, these are things that you've experienced firsthand in different war zones. How would you say, what were the differences here that you witnessed?
I think if you were to compare it to, let's say, Syria, and I was actually just reporting from Syria for the last 2 weeks, even now that we're 10 years into the war in Syria, women, of course, have been affected, but it wasn't so immediate as it was in Artsakh, when the male population essentially had to disappear to go and fight in the war. And so, like I said before, the women were sort of left alone and immediately in the worst hit areas because it was so unpredictable and indiscriminate, where these very heavy weapons were hitting, and the sheer intensity was much greater than I've seen anywhere else in any other war, actually. And this made it much more intense. And it was a shorter war, obviously, but just the sheer intensity for these 44 days made the effects so great and so greatly felt among the women, I think, of Artsakh.
Did you maybe witness anything that was broader from the context of location? For example, I think you were reporting from Stepanakert at some point. Stepanakert is the capital of Artsakh. That's not a military zone. That's a capital city like Washington, D.C., where parliaments sit, where business gets done, where children go to school. What was your experience there?
Reporting from Stepanakert during the war was frankly really, really frightening, more so than anywhere else I've been. And I include, again, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and in that assessment. Because again, like you said, Stepanakert's not a military zone and should have been safe from the bombardment, but wasn't. It was being shelled continuously, bombed continuously. And just the sense of fear was so pervasive in the whole city. I mean, this was 44 days of essentially people living in their basements and their underground shelters. And during a pandemic, no less. And of course, these underground shelters don't have ventilation. And so you've got dozens of people crammed together with there's no way to social distance or really take precautions. And the amount of infections that came out of this period was just so great. Even extending to the journalistic community who went there. I got COVID while I was there. I talked to dozens others who contracted COVID while there just because it was unavoidable. which makes the inhumanity of this war just that much clearer, that this was happening during the height of a pandemic. And I think that was the most striking thing, honestly.
When many people are afraid to step out of their homes to go to the supermarket, you're rushing to an area that actually has the COVID virus extensively and very little, if no expected healthcare available to you. So I started by saying that you were very brave. I think we have to take that into context as well. We talk about your reporting from a war zone. Could you maybe, and the impacts on women, could you maybe touch upon your role, you as a woman, and what differences you see as a woman reporting versus maybe your male counterparts? What's the difference there in your mind?
I think invariably, as a woman reporting from conflict zones, it's harder to get the military complex, anyone in any military, to take you as seriously. And this is regardless of country. It's just sort of a fact of reporting on wars as a woman, I think. So I think that in general, there's some hesitance to let a woman go into more dangerous areas, to go near soldiers, and that never changes. I think over time, if you're persistent enough, you can still get to the same places. But on the flip side, there are some good things, because I think that being a woman in a conflict zone gives you a unique insight into talking to women, to talking to families. I think that they're more likely to open up to talking to a female journalist rather than a male journalist. So there's good and bad.
Lindsay, you've been captured, kidnapped, escaped. What is it that you're afraid of? What scares you?
Well, certainly I don't want to get kidnapped or captured again, but I think beyond that, it's just, I'm afraid of more of the same, because we've seen in this last 10 years that the Syrian war and ongoing conflicts in Libya and Iraq, and of course now in Karabakh, that things seem to be getting worse, and that wars are happening more, and that certain countries are attacking vulnerable populations more and more. So my fear is that this just continues unabated.
And what challenges do you see as a journalist in, I think certainly, I sort of hearken it back to our experiences as Armenians with grandparents who were survivors of a genocide. Getting stories out of our own grandparents about their own experiences was sometimes very, very challenging. People don't want to relive that trauma. On the one hand, you're required to report accurately and thoroughly, but on the other hand, you're dealing with individuals who don't really want to talk about the trauma. I could certainly see that as being a challenge for you. How do you overcome that? What do you do?
I think you just have to be as sensitive as possible to a victim of trauma, any trauma. And certainly you step back when you can see that someone really doesn't want to talk, and maybe it would be detrimental to their mental health to talk to you, then you sort of step back. But over time, if you make yourself available, and this happens sometimes where initially someone might not want to speak, and then they contact you later and say, actually, I will talk to you, or maybe don't put me on camera, but we can do a written interview. And I think that it's persistence and sensitivity.
I'm going to ask one last question, and there's other questions that are coming up, but we'll save those for the end. But the one last question I want to ask is, what insights have you gained from women there on how the war has affected them?
I think, like I said, they're very afraid of the future. Even still, even with the ceasefire, which is mostly held with, obviously, violations fairly regularly, but it's mostly held. Still, there's a lot of uncertainty. And so I know women who are planning things planning to get married, for example, and they've sort of stepped back and put that on hold. And I think that that's really, really common now among the women in Karabakh.
Thank you very much, Ms. Snell. Certainly we'll come back to ask some more questions. I want to share with you the following letter, which started like this. Dear War, a girl is writing to you from Karabakh, a place where you've settled recently. I know you were not loved. I know you are not loved anywhere, but I will be honest with you. I want you to know you're not welcome here either. We already know each other, don't we? Aren't you tired of coming to our doors? I'm not writing this to express my anger, really. What I want to say is go away, please. These are the words of our next speaker, Lika Zakarian. She's a journalist at CivilNet from Stepanakert during the 44-day war on Artsakh. Lika kept her war diaries that gave us direct access to the bunkers in the streets of Artsakh. She's with us here now. Lika?
Yes.
Please tell us a little bit about your experience and what you witnessed.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today, and thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity. My name is Lika Zakarian. Full name is Angelica, but I prefer short Lika. And I was born in Artsakh, in the capital city, Stepanakert. By profession, I'm a political scientist, but now I work as a journalist. I started my journalist career last year. I have been working for the Armenian media outlet CivilNet since July 2020. And the area of my work was and is Artsakh. So when we first started to work, the aim was to show that Artsakh is not a conflict. It's people, it's talented youngsters, interesting characters, and a lot of life there. This is what we wanted to show, but the war didn't. It didn't take long for the war to make us wait, and it came to our homes again in September. And then we started to covering the conflict in Artsakh, the war, from a newcomer to a journalism. I immediately fell into war journalism, and I overcame some difficulties thanks to the help and support of my colleagues and my editors and CivilNet staff, because it was quite new for me. And I even living in Artsakh, we were always hearing some shootings, some explosions, but it wasn't that relevant for us to hear it every day. And usually even in 2016, when there was April war, 4 days war, it didn't come to Stepanakert. So we could hear this, we could feel this all, but we couldn't mainly feel it really, really hard. So when the war started, our main work was making video reports and photo stories. When our cameraman left for the front line, I was left, let's say, alone. And at that time, I was already dealing with more like photos and texts. The difficulty of working as a journalist was that, for example, one of the difficulties was that you have to move from one place to another place. And it makes a lot of, it's not very easy, because the city and the whole Artsakh was shelled all the time, and even Stepanakert. And to move from one place to another to cover something, to make a report, was already difficult, because there were no taxis, no cars. You could hardly see anyone outside in the streets. So that was very hard. It's not even about going to the regions, like to Martakert, Hadrut, Martuni, to do something, but even to make something in Stepanakert. And For example, if there is this drone, it's much more dangerous to be in the car than to walk, because when you walk you can find a shelter and just run and hide somewhere, but this danger will takes 30 minutes when you go by foot, on foot, and then it takes 5 minutes when you go by car. So that's why it was very difficult, and to even to transport yourself somewhere. And it's not only about the journalists, but also about simple citizens who were supposed to get food, and there were no stores and shops and markets open. So people were getting only the humanitarian aid, which was coming to the Stepanakert City Hall municipality, and people were supposed to go there and take it, but it wasn't always possible to go out from your shelter because they were continuously shelling the city. For example, me and my father sometimes were going by his car and taking a lot of food for our relatives and people whom we know to take it to everyone. Yeah, it was very hard to do, because any moment could be the last for us, because they were overly shelling. So there were many problems like this, but I wouldn't like to go to the problems. I would like to mention the COVID-19, which is the problem of the whole world in the 21st century. Honestly saying, we didn't think about COVID at all, because it didn't come to that point, because when they are shelling, you can die at that second, at that moment, at exactly that place, and you don't really think about diseases in general. And we had this press center where, like before the war, when the COVID started, there were some restrictions between Armenia and Artsakh in the border. So you had to have the COVID test, negative test, and so on. So not everyone could go there because everything costs. So in this way, we could prevent kind of, we could make the way that COVID wasn't spread in Artsakh. We didn't have many cases. But during the war, we couldn't do anything anymore, and they were coming journalists from the whole world and so on, and nobody was checking. And I remember in the press center, in some days there was everyone had COVID, and nobody was thinking about it, because it just it wasn't the priority, and people were kind of taking it easy because there were problems much more serious. And during the war, it wasn't always possible to go to basements and shoot a report, and because there were days that when they were shelling, and the shellings did not stop. In order to not to go crazy in those days, I started keeping a diary, which I did not call it. I didn't call it a diary at the beginning. It got its name from the readers, and enjoyed a certain love among the people. At first, I didn't intend to make it continuously. It turned out spontaneously, actually. The posts were published on my Facebook page and my Telegram channel in Russian. They were originally written in Russian and in English on Sivnet's website. That was the story of the diary, because I wanted to do something, and it wasn't really possible to make something outside, and you are staying with your thoughts, and that's the only way you can express your emotions. I did not only play the role of a journalist in covering the war in Artsakh, and that wasn't the only reason why I stayed in Artsakh. This is a very special and dear topic for me, and because Artsakh is my home, and sometimes it was difficult to write about Artsakh as a topic, to take pictures and show the bombed structures, to see any relatives in the basements. Those emotions could not stay just in the corner, and that is why I consider that I have done my journalistic work through reports and pictures, and as a resident of Artsakh, I have written and published the war diary. So that was my very very dear topic for me, and that's why I couldn't just make it leave it only in a professional way, but I needed to also spread some emotional parts because I felt so. My whole family took part in the war. It was very hard to work, knowing that your brother is in the front line, your mother is in a hospital, and which had been shelled not once by the enemy. And my father was, who is disabled person from the first war. He was supporting to transfer the military equipment as a driver. Everyone was worried about each other and was asking someone else to leave and go to Yerevan, to Armenia, to a safer place. So I couldn't just sit and watch, and me and my mother stayed until the evacuation period, as much as we could stay. To be a woman during the war, to be outside during the bombing, of course, is given with difficulty, especially since the people next to you do not have much faith in the image of women in the war. They think that women should be in a safe place in Armenia, not to get involved in men's war. But I think that women have a special place in the war. They can be no less useful than men, and I know many women who baked bread for the entire army and civilians. The women in white uniforms were admitted to hospitals day and night and operated on soldiers without a second's rest, who served as fixers for international journalists, or who were themselves journalists and visited the hotspots of the war. That is why I believe that women can and should have their contribution to preventing wars and considering and conducting negotiations as well. I am just an Armenian from Artsakh who has lived in a country, let's say, forgotten by God, and a country which, by the beauty of its nature, is a paradise on the earth, where people eat the most organic and pure food and enjoy the historical and cultural heritage created over the centuries. Where people love life and want to live. I'm proud that I was able to make my modest contribution to the coverage of the war and archiving of the Artsakh war and Artsakh history in this period. I would like to say that we were born and we lived in the conflict, but the young people, young women and men of Artsakh don't want to die in it, and because we just want to live and to make any possible way this happen.
Thank you, Lika.
And these are the words. Yeah, these are the words that I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lika. And certainly when we come back for the Q&A, we would like you to speak more specifically about the impacts, not just today, but as you see it from the perspective of teenagers to early 20s, what your hopes and desires are for the future, how you see the future. So when we come back to the Q&A, you can speak more specifically to the youth of Artsakh. I think we would really appreciate that. Our next presenter is Dr. Shant Shekirdimian. He's a pediatric surgeon from Los Angeles, California. For many years, he has worked voluntarily in Armenia, focusing on improving medical education and quality assurance systems. He traveled to Armenia and Artsakh during the 44-day war on a mission to save lives. What he's seen will be difficult to comprehend. He is first on scene when a bomb has unscrambled our bodies, and he has to figure out a way to put it all together. As I understand it, Dr. Shekerdimian, you go back and forth quite frequently. If you can just share with us your experiences as it relates to the war, as it relates to the pandemic, and specifically your perspective on how it's impacting women.
Thank you for having me on the panel. I feel underqualified after hearing all of the panelists before me speak. Many have actually highlighted a lot of what we can talk about on the healthcare side. One of the things that really struck me was Mavik's comments about neither war nor pandemic being gender neutral. And I think it is incumbent upon me to sort of anecdotally talk about how that is absolutely true in the healthcare sector and in what we saw during the war and what we have been seeing since that time. I think it's also very important to start off with a perspective and the understanding that this was actually the second Karabakh War. And when we talk about the effects of the war and the gender neutrality, I think it's important to understand some of the perspectives of what effects the first war had on the population and the women specifically going into the war. I think the disproportionate loss of men during the first war and the ensuing increase in responsibilities and burden on women, both in the household and socially, had led to a lot of both physical and mental consequences to the health of the women, and has also created barriers to seeking access to care, which of course is very important both with regards to the pandemic as well as the war. We had definitely continued to see that. We saw that during the war. We continue to see that with regards to particularly women who prioritize the other needs of people around them and oftentimes neglect to seek care that is necessary for their own health and well-being. I think it's clear that the synergistic effects of the worsening of the pandemic during the war in Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia was very clear. The peak of the number of COVID cases that happened shortly after the initiation of war not only affected the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also in Armenia, to the point where we had actually a backlog and an inability to hospitalize all patients that required hospitalization. And unfortunately, the health system was strained to the point where some people were not even able to make it to the hospital to get the care that they needed, and unfortunately succumbed to the pandemic, which could have been preventable, obviously, if the peak wasn't there or wasn't exacerbated by the war. We all know that we all have heard and read about the reports, and some of us saw firsthand the deliberate shelling of and destruction of healthcare facilities. The Women and Children's Hospital in Stepanakert was significantly damaged during the war. This, as well as the war itself, really complicated the care of pregnant women and children who had to be evacuated in very dangerous and unsafe circumstances to Armenia. And we very much saw the effects of that as well. I think the other thing that, again, just anecdotally, I'd like to really highlight and mention is the silver lining of all of this, which is seeing our colleagues, our women colleagues in healthcare, and the bravery and the extreme contributions that they provided during both the war and the pandemic, We have been collaborating very closely with our colleagues in healthcare, both in Armenia and Artsakh. And I would say that most of these interactions have left me very humbled at times where I wasn't strong enough or I was afraid. Many of our female colleagues or women colleagues were the ones that were on the forefront. By forefront, I mean in healthcare, not on the front lines of the war, volunteering to do the things that that again sometimes I was not ready to do, both with regards to providing care in the hospitals, with regards to taking the risk of participating in the management of taking care of patients at a time where COVID was so rampant and it was impossible to follow the proper infectious diseases guidelines and minimize risk to oneself as healthcare providers, as well as on the leadership side on the in healthcare. And I'm truly awed by their contributions and humbled by all of the work that has been done.
Thank you, Dr. Shakerdemian. When we come back to you on the Q&A, if you can also touch upon the cases of injuries related to white phosphorus. Certainly that's not the kind of thing that I'm sure you've seen in your practice at UCLA, but when you're there and you have a patient who has symptoms, you have to figure out what to do. And if we can talk about that at the end during the Q&A, we'd appreciate it. In December, Karina Abedisian authored an article entitled Human Rights Organizations and Victim Blaming. She told of an incident where Azerbaijani soldiers had uploaded another gruesome video they had taken as they beheaded an elderly Armenian civilian man who begged for his life. This video was not leaked, but published. Like all other videos and similar war crimes and acts of violence against Armenians. Karina Abedisian is a political scientist focusing on governance, social movements, and new media and communications in Eurasia, with an area focus on Russia and the Caucasus. Ms. Abedisian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. Greetings to my fellow speakers, Madam Moderator and Ambassador. On September 27th, Azerbaijan, with support from Turkey, so two autocratic states, launched the war of choice on their neighbors, the republics of Armenia and Artsakh, two fledgling democracies, during a pandemic. While the fighting may have stopped, the information war continues. The speakers today discussed the impact of the Second Artsakh War on the ground, but the informational aspect of the war has been just as significant, and the front line of that information war is literally in your hand. Today, I'll speak about the gendered abuse experienced by Armenian women online in the context of the Artsakh War. The targeting of women for rape and war is now well known and well studied, thanks in large part to the bravery of Bosniak women who brought their experiences to the world at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the mid-1990s. Less understood is the targeting of women online in the context of war, and this represents an area that is in dire need of study. As a UN Women report, which came out in 2020, called Online and ICT Facilitated Violence Against Women and Girls During COVID-19, as it stated, available research suggests that when women and girls have access to the internet, they face online violence more often than men through a, quote, continuum of multiple, recurring, and interrelated forms of gender-based violence. And emerging research, by the way, shows that this abuse has become worse during the pandemic. But how does this fit into the context of military conflict between states? Many, if not most people who use social media experience online harassment at one point or another. But what's happening here goes beyond even more severe cases of sustained aggressive abuse. The constant belittling and abusive comments have come to characterize the everyday reality of Armenians online, and in particular of Armenian women. Perpetrators range from individuals and networked groups of Azerbaijani and Turkish government-linked agents online. While individual Armenians also often engage in mutual harassment efforts, there is little evidence that they fall under state-run coordination. In contrast, the governments of Turkey and Azerbaijan actively promote Armenophobia and hate speech against Armenians on the official level, and high-ranking officials in both Azerbaijan and Turkey have made open threats to genocide and physical violence against Armenians wherever they are. The online abuse cannot be divorced from these state policies and their attendant state-led campaigns of disinformation and erasure. Of course, anyone speaking out against Azerbaijan's aggression online has become a target. Let's note the coordinated smear campaign against American Senator Bob Menendez after his denunciation of the September offensive. Armenian men and boys are also very frequent targets of online abuse and harassment. But Armenian women and girls are disproportionately targeted, especially Armenian women journalists, analysts like myself, and civil society actors, for whom a freedom to express their opinion about the world represents an element of their work and lives. Moreover, attacks targeting women are different from those on men. They're more likely to focus on their physical appearance and sexuality, and include threats of sexual violence and humiliating or sexualized imagery. With the end of hostilities in November 2020, the violence experienced by Armenians in the real world, in Artsakh and Armenia, simply moved into cyberspace without changing its basic nature. Thus, 4 months after the ceasefire, Armenians online are still confronted daily by online violence from Azerbaijani and Turkish government-linked accounts, invading their professional and private spaces. The abuse can be prolific and feel unrelenting. Whether we're in the conflict zone or not, the attacks evoke physical warfare. It feels like low intensity, constant bombardment. As Finnish journalist Jessica Aro said, quote, "Women are targeted in cyber wars the same way they are in kinetic wars." Post-conflict situations are generally characterized as the formal cessation of violence between armed combatants. But the dominant approach to peace often obscures other kinds of violence, such as online harassment, the disproportionate targets of which are women. Issues like gendered violence are considered soft issues, as opposed to the hard issues of military security. Thus, this understanding of peace is one in which women's security is not central. While some Armenian women who receive gendered abuse online engage in political discussions, many do not, and are simply Armenian women online with a public voice. For those who are outspoken or whose work is visible online, the harassment is more severe. But the worst abuse is saved for Armenian women from Artsakh. This harassment is meant to silence critical voices around the conflict. Harassment and abuse follows any expression of political thought by these women. But what's notable is that the abuse is just as bad when the individual merely speaks about her home in Artsakh or her connection to it. And I want people to think about that, to imagine a reality in which expressions of love and connection to community and land is subject to hate with the intent to silence. Kanar and Mariam Avetisyan are two sisters from Stepanakert. Mariam is a filmmaker documenting the rebuilding of life in Artsakh after the war. Her series, called The Desire to Live, can be found on YouTube. Kanar, who provides the English subtitles for Mariam and who helps manage Mariam's social media accounts, recently told me about the harassment and hate speech they both receive from Azerbaijani users every day, and I'm sharing this with permission. Recently, Kanar joined a Facebook group dedicated to peaceful dialogue between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. As soon as she introduced herself as being from Stepanakert, the harassment immediately began and became so vitriolic that the group's administrators were forced to close the comments and ban several individuals. It seems as though the mere existence of women from Artsakh is considered a threat, even in a group dedicated to peace building. Another young woman from Artsakh, a presenter at Artsakh TV with an active Twitter presence, is the target of an extraordinary amount of hate speech and harassment. Every single communication of hers is met with derision and often with sexualized threats, including from accounts linked to Azerbaijani officials. As a report from the International Center for Journalists has shown, online violence targeting women has a number of common characteristics. First, it's networked, meaning it's often organized and orchestrated and can involve state-sponsored sock puppet networks and acts of so-called patriotic trolling. Second, it radiates. with women and their families and among their online audiences that are also targeted. Third, it's intimate. Threats are personal. They arrive on mobile phone screens first thing in the morning and lasting at night, and they're often sexualized. What happens online creates new dangers offline, and the two are absolutely connected. Similar to how the orchestration of the Armenian genocide was gendered, as scholar Lerna Kmekcioglu argues, the Azerbaijani repertoire of war has rendered policies such as the real-life physical targeting of women possible and effective. We've already seen cases of Armenian civilian women being kidnapped after the ceasefire agreement was signed. When hate against Armenians is so institutionalized and not seriously challenged by civil society on one hand, nor by international bodies on the other, every single member of the nation is imputed as deserving of dehumanization simply for who they are. Platform policies, that of Twitter, for example, lack a clear definition of targeted harassment, meaning much of the abuse is not violative of its terms of service, leaving these accounts to continue their harassment without facing consequences. There's also a lack of intersectional expertise in content moderation, something discussed in detail by Nina Jankovic et al. In a report for the Wilson Center, which results in this abuse towards marginalized communities going unaddressed. Targets of the abuse bear the onus of detection and reporting. Managing an onslaught of abuse on social media requires time to block, report, and mute abusers. These burdens are disregarded and affect women's daily lives offline. The abuse can inflict psychological injury, cause professional harm, and forces women out of public spaces and discussions. In all conflicts, women suffer in ways specific to women. But I want to highlight the fact that they're not passive and not necessarily victims. They're members of the armed forces, engaged as politicians, leaders of NGOs and communities. They can have critical perspectives on their position, make choices, and organize collectively. In this way, the participation of women in post-conflict processes is vital for society to move forward. Thus, the disproportionate targeting of Armenian women online has direct implications for the peace-building process. It can discourage women from participating in peace-building measures, running for office, and it can push them out of politics or lead them to disengage from online political discourse in ways that harm their political effectiveness. For those women who persevere, the abuse can cause psychological harm and waste significant energy and time. And their constant harassment online presents a democratic and national security and a conflict resolution challenge. There's now an even greater need for governments to hold these companies accountable for addressing all forms of hate speech, harassment, and disinformation on their platforms. International organizations like the UN need to be part of the solution to protect women online so they can participate fully. UN entities which have so far been unwilling or unable to address this harassment and disinformation need to press for more action and develop new standards for platform transparency and accountability that can help address this undermining of online political debate. To conclude, the growth of abuse and harassment against individuals presenting facts or perspectives that do not align with the official narratives of Azerbaijan or Turkey online is a dangerous development for democracy and justice in the region, as are their agents' increasing reliance on relentless propaganda and violence to intimidate and ultimately mute critical voices. When more powerful states institutionalize the dehumanization of an entire group to this extent, they pave the way for their violent physical erasure. And ultimately, this is what we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Avedissian. You touch upon a very important point that is a significant project for the Armenian Bar Association as well. One of the issues that we've been looking at is the enforcement of hate speech online, and certainly in places like the United States, where there are laws to protect the online victims. We certainly can't find the equivalent in other parts of the world. And so I think what you're highlighting is a very important point. I think we're coming to the end of our time. So if I could just circle back to our presenters with those final questions and final words. There's quite a few questions in the Q&A, but I don't think we'll be able to touch upon all of them. If we could just pick up, Mavic, with the positive roles, maybe sometimes, and then the negative impacts that you have seen, for example, with trying to reach individuals, especially women in areas that don't really have the access to information. You were talking earlier about Facebook and TikTok being the opportune place to get information about the pandemic. Tell us a little bit more about the role and responsibility of a social media platform, in your opinion.
There is a lot, but as we know, it's very difficult to police or monitor the production and distribution of content on social media, and the magnitude of the hatred and violence propagated on social media actually prompted our organization, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, to promote a boycott of Facebook in September of last year. We timed it for the International Day of Peace. But as we encourage everyone to join us, we also know that many women's rights organizations and civil society see this as their main way of reaching out to their constituencies. It's the principal platform for their advocacy. So it's a real dilemma. And while we promote self-policing and strict observance of of codes of conduct, we are actually holding the Facebook and other social media companies to account to invest more resources and strengthen accountability and fact-checking mechanisms, and ensure immediate removal of false content that incite hatred and violence. And we're also encouraging the private sector to remove their advertising from Facebook to protest the platform's complicity in promoting hatred and violence. Equally important, we're calling on governments to adopt robust, accountable regulations for Facebook and other social media platforms, again, for the same reason, to prevent the spread of hateful and violent information and the dissemination of fake news. Yeah, so for our fellow civil society actors, we always remind everyone to be vigilant in their use of social media platform, and also come together in pressuring the telecommunication companies to do their part. They're earning billions of dollars from these platforms. This is the least that they can do to monitor content and insist on strictly observing codes of conduct.
Thank you. And Lindsay, you've certainly been the target of quite a bit of hate mail and on your social media accounts. How do you address that? How do you handle that?
For the most part, I just sort of ignore it or interact with it, especially if the claims that they're making are incredibly ludicrous, which they often are. I think it's toxic, certainly. And it's something that really Twitter, Facebook, Instagram aren't doing a lot to combat, or they're combating it in sort of a biased way, where if I get a death threat and then I share a screenshot of the death threat, my account will be suspended, whereas the account that made the death threat won't be. But for the most part, I think it's important to ignore it and to let them, to show that it's really not bothering you that much.
Thank you. And again, just by way of final thoughts here, Dr. Shekerdemian, if you could just touch upon the issue of the white phosphorus and what implications you saw during your treatment and your work in Armenia.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short. I have to say that I was not directly involved in the management of this specific process, but I would comment as a surgeon. Burns are the most painful, traumatic, difficult to manage, much more deadly than can be imagined just by initial visualization type of injuries. I have been involved in the coordination of the care of these patients that still remain, most of which still remain hospitalized. This particular agent that has been used is notorious and very difficult to take off the body, and therefore has very pronounced and long-standing effects, and will lead to an extremely challenging, long, chronic course for all of the patients, for all of the people that have been afflicted by the white phosphorus burns, many of which will have lifelong issues, needs for repeated surgeries, and increased risk of cancers of the skin and other complications of these injuries. Thank
you. Dr. Avedisian, you spoke about the, we started by talking about the disproportionate effects on women, and you touched upon women who are in positions of influence. There was a study recently that talked about women in politics who are greater targets of violence, not just by the general public, but by their male counterparts. And we've certainly seen this in the Western world as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Any kind of threat to established hierarchies of power is going to be pushed back on by people who feel like perhaps they're losing their privileged status. In preparation for this talk, I was reading about research on women who are outspoken online, even those who don't speak about gendered issues or kind of controversial issues, still get targeted just for the fact that they are speaking out. And a lot of the violent language used in regards to them evokes this sense of kind of silencing. Like, for example, there was a woman who was speaking about a political issue in the UK, and some of the abuse was shown to show that, you know, someone was saying, for example, that he wanted to punch her in the throat. So specific kind of symbolic instances of threat to violence that specifically kind of targets their voice or what they're kind of doing in the world. So again, it's this challenging of the hierarchies of power that I think kind of unsettle a lot of people.
Thank you. Lika, I hope we haven't lost your connection. I know it was a little bit spotty earlier. Are you still there? Are you able to turn on your video?
Yes, I'm here.
You know,
Yeah.
in many ways, you know, people of my generation look to you and the people of your generation for hope and survival. Could you just touch on very briefly what you think the future holds from your perspective? You're in your early 20s, and what is it that motivates you and your counterparts, your girlfriends, your friends? How do you see the future?
That's a very hard question, because the main thing now, the main problem in ARTA is that we cannot predict anything. We don't know, we have no idea what's going to happen to the area and to us. So when we talk about the future, we don't have the image of future. This is missing. And I think that is very bad because some people cannot imagine their lives in Artsakh anymore. I know some young people who are going to leave Artsakh and go to Russia, for example, or to Europe to study and establish their life there because they want a peaceful life. And you know, that's not that's normal that people want a peaceful life, that people want stability, which we don't have in Artsakh. But mostly the young people are they really want to stay, and we really love Artsakh, we really do. And we don't know anything about the future because it doesn't depend on us. Whoever can say anything about democracy, about that our life is in our hands, or there are some, I don't know, international organizations who are making this right, or making it, I don't know, appropriate for people to live anywhere. But this, we don't believe in this anymore, I could say. I'm talking about me and my friends, the people whom I know. We don't believe to humanitarian law anymore. We don't believe to the international organizations, like, I don't know, these old values which are people talking about, you know. We know one thing, we are the Artsakh, like the Karabakh is so small now, and it's not, we don't even know what is going to happen to this last, I don't know, 3,000 kilometer square area, what's going to happen with it. And we don't believe to the peacekeepers, or I don't know, to the Armenian or Artsakh authorities, no, to the media, to Artur Hovhannisyan, or to anyone else. This a very special thing happening to use of Artsakh. You know, in Artsakh, young people didn't have this critical thinking for a very long time, and now they are looking to everything so critically, awfully critically, and I think that's very confusing, and it makes life for us very hard. I don't want to say encouraging things or sad things. I'm just saying how it is, what we have today. And what we have today is that we have no vision. We don't know, like we have this vision for 5 years, while peacekeepers are there, but you know, everyone is talking about Karabakh, but they are sleeping and waking up in a very peaceful area. But we wake up from the sounds of I don't know, bombs or anything, from the sound of explosions in the middle of night, even today, even like now, because some Azeri guys can go out in Shushi and make this, I don't know, these sounds to scare people. So we live there, and we see and feel it every day. That's why telling about peacekeeping forces, I don't know, maybe they're doing it very well, their work, I don't know, but to say that we rely on anyone is wrong, it's not true. And to say that we can rely on us is not true as well, because we can do nothing, and nobody cares about our thoughts, rights, and I don't know, our desires. So that's a very hard question.
Yeah, I think, Lika, what you're saying is that the work has to continue. It has to be persistent, and it can't. We can't ever slow down, so that we can definitely ensure the safety and security of everyone in that region. Your Excellency, I'd like to come back to you and say thank you for the opportunity to bring forward this program. I think our viewers definitely enjoyed hearing the information from the 5 very different perspectives, its impacts on women and girls. If you could offer some closing remarks.
Thank you. And thank you, Lucy. And first, I want to thank you for facilitating today's discussion in such a professional manner. And let me thank all of our panelists for their presentation in such a passionate and personal way. I want to thank Mavic for her work in assisting countries and the civil society partners in taking follow-up actions for the implementation of the Resolution 1325. I want to thank Lindsay Snell for her bravery and for making sure that the international community gets access to accurate information from conflict zones and from the humanitarian emergency situations. And the personal story of Lika Zakarian, a young woman with such a courage and perseverance and love for her homeland, could be very educative for Armenian youth and girls, and many beyond Armenia too. And I want to thank Dr. Shakerdimian for his work in Nagorno-Karabakh and for his medical activities, for saving lives and for helping to alleviate the suffering of people that were trapped between war and pandemic. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Karina Avedisian for speaking about the political aspects of the violence against women and girls. And I want to thank her also for reminding us that the United Nations needs to re-equip itself better in delivering on its prevention functions and on gender equality and on women, peace and security agenda. Well, I thank once again. I thank all the panelists and participants of this event. And as I said during my opening remarks, the event was being broadcast live, and it will be available online on our Facebook page and on UN Web TV. Thank you all, and this event is concluded.